Michelle Marie McGrath.
Welcome to Unclassified Woman, and today I'm delighted to be talking to the very inspiring Marianne Elliott. Marianne is a mouthy introvert who collects treasures and tells tales. As National Director for Action Station, a digital platform to enable social action, she rallies New Zealanders to fight for truth, justice, and a kinder way. Trained as a human rights lawyer, she worked in Timor-Leste, New Zealand, and the Gaza Strip before going to Afghanistan, where she served in the United Nations. There she discovered stories were her secret weapon and yoga was her medicine. Marianne is also a writer. Her memoir, Zen Under Fire, is available now, and a yoga teacher. When she's not on her yoga mat or at the keyboard, you'll find her introducing her nieces and nephews to the joys of political action or reading feminist crime fiction. Now, I highly, highly recommend you grab a copy of Zen Under Fire if you haven't read that yet. It is a brilliant book. It's a vivid account of Marianne's experience living and working in the world's most notorious battlefield, as well as sharing the incredible details of her role when she was working for the UN. Marianne tells a very personal story of the shattering effect that the high-stress environment had on her and her relationships, and asks what it really means to do good in a country that's under siege from within. This is a very honest, moving, and at times terrifying true story of one woman's time peacekeeping in one of the most dangerous places on earth. Now, it's so moving and just very evocative, and this is something that really stayed with me for quite some time afterwards. It really had an impact on me. It's extremely thought-provoking, so grab a copy of that if you haven't already. Go to her website at marianne-elliott.com. That's marianne-elliott.com, and I really hope that you enjoy our conversation today. And so great to have you here today, all the way over there in New Zealand.
It's lovely to be here talking to you.
Oh, and look, I can just listen to the Kiwi accent all day. I love it. And New Zealand, one of my favourite places. So I'm always so happy to talk to anyone there, really. So really, thank you for your time today, discussing this very important subject. And so just to give us a little bit of background, Marianne, would you mind sharing a bit about whether you've not had a child due to personal choice or whether it's been circumstantial?
Yeah, and as I think probably many people share the experience that I have, which I would say that the answer is probably a little of both, in that I've made choices that have led to me being in circumstances which then made it very, very difficult to have a child. So I think that the simplest way to answer that question is to say I didn't really think a lot about having children as a young woman. I had strong interests and aspirations around having a life that involved travel and meaningful work. I wanted to be a human rights advocate and or a foreign correspondent. And so I made choices in the early stage of my adulthood around that. I studied law and I took jobs in places like Gaza and lived abroad, but hadn't made the choice that I didn't want to have children, just sort of wasn't really assuming that I needed to think about that quite yet. And then I sort of came to a point in my life when I realized that it was probably time to think about it, and decided I did want to have children, and then found it very, very difficult to find a partner.
Yeah.
with whom I could have children, or who was interested in having children with me. And I mean, the sort of simplest version of my story is I ended up finding myself in two sort of serious long-term relationships back to back, both of which were with men who did not want to have children. And in the first one, I didn't stay in the relationship for very long because I did want to have children, and that became, a reason to end the relationship. And then it took some time to meet anybody else. And really, by the time I met my current partner, I was in my mid-30s, mid to late 30s. I'd say coming into my late 30s. And when we got to the point of talking about having children, initially I didn't think that his position was definitive. So I think perhaps I misunderstood or understood what I wanted to understand, which was that there was still a possibility that he might be open to having children. And I guess by the time it became clear that that wasn't a possibility, I was definitely in my late 30s and had to make a choice. So at that point, it was a choice for me. Did I stay in a relationship with somebody with whom I had a wonderful relationship in every other way, and not have children, or did I leave that relationship with the hope of having children, but obviously no guarantee. That was a very difficult choice.
Yeah, and so, Marianne, did you ever consider at any point, okay, well, I would be happy to embark upon having a child on my own, or were you really clear in your mind that no, I only want to embark upon that if I'm in a committed relationship?
No, having a child on my own, I had no sort of fundamental problem with that. I think that would have been financially very challenging for somebody who'd spent, her 20s and 30s working in the human rights sector, which is not exactly a great way to save. But at the point, I guess, so that was one of the options available to me at that point. There wasn't an option to stay with this person who I loved and have children. So the option was to end that relationship and go about either pursuing the path of having children by myself, which probably would have been quite financially challenging, or trying to find another partner in my late 30s, which is increasingly difficult to meet people, let alone meet people with whom you're a great match, let alone meet people with whom you're a great match who want to have children with you and then be able to have children, and all of that.
Yeah,
in a fairly short period of time once you're 39 at that stage. So I guess the way I would say it is it was circumstantial, but obviously there'd been a series of choices made along the way that put me in those circumstances, and then I just didn't get the choice that I wanted. I wanted the choice to stay with the person who I loved and have a child, and that wasn't one of the ones I I often think that life is a bit like that. We perhaps expect that life will be able to choose between option A, which is exactly what we want, and option B, which is not what we want. And I think sometimes you end up realising that it might be choosing between option B and option C.
Yeah, and it's interesting how these things have different emphasis at different age. So, for example, in your 20s, I know I was thinking, oh, look, even though I'd got married very young, I thought I don't really need to think about having a child yet. I mean, I just kind of assumed, I might do that later on, but again, never felt that driving force. But then as time marches on, and like you, I was always very focused on having lots of different experiences, and travel and adventure and all that were really important to me. And so it's funny how time goes very quickly, and then again these things change again, the dynamic of that in your 30s and your priorities, and then what you're thinking about, and again your relationships change. So it's really tricky, because even though we do have all these choices and options, the reality is, of course, for women, we do have that limited window of fertility where that's a possibility, and then exactly as you mention, then the thing is, well, one, am I in a relationship at all? And then if I am I in a relationship with somebody who's suitable for me to embark upon having a child with? And do we both want that at the same time? Or, or does one person, they're keen and the other one's not so? So it's very complex, I feel.
It is very complex. And it was a very, and when you find yourself in any one of those situations, whether your situation is that you're not in a partnered relationship and you don't want to or don't feel able to pursue having children alone, or you are in a partnered relationship but it's just not happening even though you both want it and are trying, or you are in a partnered relationship but one of you doesn't want it. I mean, all of these different variations, which I've had friends in all of those situations and more. I think one of the hardest parts for me was suddenly realizing there's this piece of my life that feels really big and really important, and I can't control it.
That's right.
And I think I've thought about it a lot. I feel like there are so many things about modern life that we've kind of mastered, that we can control lots of things through technology and all sorts of ways in which we can. And this was something that I could not control the circumstances.
Yeah.
And I really had to find a way to not feel like a victim, not feel helpless, not feel sort of betrayed by my circumstances, and take back that sense of being an agent of my life. That was really a big deal for me, was to go from, this isn't fair, it's not fair, this isn't what I wanted, why can't my partner want this even just because I want it, which is of course a crazy thing, because having a child is not something that I think you should decide to do just because somebody else wants it.
No. Well, people do though. People do, don't they?
They do, and because other people do, you see, I thought, well, why can't my partner do that? And then I realized, because one of the reasons I fell in love with him is because he's so thoughtful, and, he doesn't make decisions without thinking them through carefully. Anyway, there was definitely a big moment for me, was the moment when I had to say, I am not a victim of my circumstances. I have a choice.
Yeah.
And in this case, my choice is either to stay in this relationship and accept the terms of it and embrace them and embrace everything that comes with that, or it's completely within my control. I can choose to leave this relationship and seek something on different terms. And I really had to take responsibility for that, and not sit around saying it's not fair, why doesn't he change so that I can have this thing that I want. So that was a big deal for me, and it was quite a big, I feel like it was kind of an important lesson to learn.
Yeah But not easy at all when you're going through all of that.
No.
And so did you ever feel any pressure, like from family or friends, because of what was going on with them, that you felt that the pressure to make that happen, in inverted commas?
I did. I don't take that sort of pressure. What's the word? I'm not very susceptible to that kind of pressure. My parents, my mother in particular, was very, very, very careful not to ever apply any such pressure. Very careful. And I would say I never felt any pressure at all from my mother.
Which is great.
Yeah, she was very mindful of that. My other members of my family, I think, would express this desire for me to have this in my life because they knew I wanted it. And so it was less pressure and more, if you want this, we want you to have it. And so we want you to make the choices that will help you get this. So it was, again, less pressure. I would say that the pressure I felt was mostly from friends. And again, I'm not terribly susceptible to it, so I didn't feel that I was very much influenced by it, but I found it quite hurtful.
Yeah. And what were the sort of things that they would say that you found hurtful or insensitive?
I think probably things that are very familiar to any women have not had children. I always found it difficult to process when people used sort of this idea of motherhood being sort of the pinnacle of
womanhood.
When they would, talk about this experience of becoming a mother as being the most important experience of their lives, but then generalize it. So not just speaking to themselves, but generalizing it as being the most important moment of a woman's life. And then I think the thing that I always found the most hurtful was people who would express the sense that before they had become parents, they were somehow shallow or selfish, or didn't really understand what it meant to love somebody else, and that really only becoming a parent could transform you from this shallow, superficial, selfish person into this, heart-opened, world cracked open to love. And I found that probably the most hurtful.
Yeah. And the thing is with that is maybe that's 100% true for that person. But we all experience love in different ways, and we all open up through different life experiences. And so it is kind of ridiculous because it's something that's just not quantifiable. I mean, you can't measure how deep or how intense an experience of love is for anyone. It's such a personal thing. So yeah, it's very frustrating to hear that kind of comment like, oh, you don't know what love is until you've had that experience of love for a child. And we only have to look at the number of children who are ignored, abused, and orphaned, abandoned in the world to know that that is not every woman's experience. Even if they've had a child, not every woman does feel that, actually.
No, and then I always think the other side of that is, I only have to look at people like my Buddhist, the Buddhist teachers in my life who are without a doubt, the most profoundly loving women in whose presence I have ever been, and who do not have children. To be, utterly clear that people, that deep, compassionate, unconditional loving heart can be awakened in ways other than having children. I believe that having a baby is a sort of a biological shortcut to opening that unconditional loving heart, but it doesn't, like you say, it's not automatic, and it's simply not the only way.
Absolutely, and there are so many people who would not necessarily feel that at all, but then again, it's a taboo to be able to talk about that openly. So there'd be so many women who, again, would never voice that publicly because they'd fear the judgment and the backlash from that. So it's just it's kind of difficult often to have these very honest conversations because people do, feel subjected to a lot of criticism or judgment if they are completely honest with what's going on from them because, as you say, motherhood is held up to be this pinnacle experience. And maybe for some people that it really is. But again, it's dangerous to generalize because that's not the case for every woman. But it is the fantasy that we're sold, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you say that because I have had moments, like very bonding, intimate moments of conversation with friends who are parents, particularly women who are mothers, where because I don't have children, there are sort of forbidden things that they can say to me.
Yeah.
Particularly now that I think maybe when I was in the thick of that sort of very painful process of deciding whether I stayed and sort of closed the door on that possibility for my life or left and tried to pursue it. I think while I was in the thick of that, that was probably a time when it wouldn't have been the best topic to embark on with me. But now that I've passed through that and I'm very clearly on the side of, no, I'm not having children and I'm, I'm really, really okay about that. I think there are interesting conversations that I can have with people because they can tell me about, feelings they have about parenthood that don't fit the sort of socially endorsed narrative. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. And so when you came to a point when you thought, okay, well, maybe this is not going to be part of my experience. And like, as you said, you like came to a point of closing the door on that. Did you then go through a period of grieving?
I feel like I'd been grieving before that.
Yeah.
So maybe when I say, I guess there was a moment when it felt to me like it was done. And not done forever, and there's never any echoes of it that are, there's ripples and echoes of the fact that will not be part of my life that show up, periodically. And but they show up now with a kind of softness. There's a sort of a soft, just that reminder that there are whole realms of the human experience that I'm not going to be part of. On the other hand, I've visited prisoners in Afghan jails. It's probably not an experience,
we can't all have every experience available to us, can we?
No. So, there are, and I know friends who have, chosen or not chosen or stumbled into or, sometimes really fallen into the path of motherhood, who have those same moments of the path not traveled and thinking, I wonder what my life would have been like if I had not had these children and had instead gone off and done the sorts of things that Marianne's done. So, I think that's a part of human experience. We can't walk all the paths. And so there will always be moments when you have the moments of what if, but I would say that the grieving, the really painful, the really just, the deep, deep sadness was through that process for me. So that, I realize that will vary for everybody, but when I finally I actually went to a therapist and went to therapy once a week for 6 months to process this, and largely because I wanted to be very confident that I wouldn't wake up one day, 10 years down the track and have regrets or resent my partner because I'd made the decision without really, really ensuring that I'd, turned over the rocks and seen what was underneath, what the feelings were underneath them. So I did quite deep processing work, and then the culmination of that process was I went to a silent Zen retreat in New Mexico, and I was in silence for a week, and it was sort of the last period and I wrote. We were allowed to write, and I wrote and wrote and wrote about this until I knew it was done.
Great.
And then I was able to come home, and I think my partner, it took him longer to feel really confident. I think there was still a period where he was worried that one day I would wake up and say, I shouldn't have done this. Like, staying with you and giving up this thing that I wanted was a bad choice, and I regret it. And he never wanted to be the cause of that kind of a regret. But I think as time's gone on and it's become clearer and clearer to him that I don't carry that with me anymore, that doesn't show up in our relationship or in any of, when we have issues, that doesn't pop up.
In any arguments, you don't that doesn't kind of come up in the midst of it.
No. So, yeah.
And so, because I was just thinking about that, obviously people use different tools to help them when they're going through that kind of experience and they're trying to come to a place of resolution within them. So obviously you had a weekly session with a therapist, you went and did your meditation retreat, you did
example, it sounds like you were doing like a lot of writing and journaling. And so what else do you think helped you? Or that was your main way of expressing that?
Actually, no. I think the thing that helped me the most of all was that I had one friend who was in a similar situation. And I mean a very similar situation, because it's quite rare to have, because of the very complex and diverse ways in which women find themselves not in a position either to want to have or to be able to have children. This was sort of unusually similar. And so we were friends, and our partners were friends, and our partners both didn't want to have children, and we did. In her case, her partner had actually changed his mind over the course of their marriage. So, that was not, at least I think, in any case, we ended up in a similar situation, and we both needed to make this decision to stay in the relationship and not have children or to leave. And I would say by far the most supportive thing for me through that whole time was having this one friend who I could meet and go for a walk with and say anything I needed to say, and know that nothing that I said would be sort of triggering her because she was in a slightly different situation. You know what I mean? It was just this incredibly precious relationship with somebody who was in such a similar situation that I could express completely openly the things that I was struggling with. And I think that's very difficult, because if you have a friend who's even in a slightly different situation, that slight difference can be enough that the things that you're feeling at a moment could be hard for them to hear or process.
Yeah. And especially if you're close friends, they're either like they've just had a child or they're trying to, and they're excited and very focused on that, it can make those conversations quite awkward. So, I mean, it's so great that you had that person there that you could really voice everything to.
And one of the things that we both would hear quite often that we found extremely unhelpful was people would tell us either that our partners would change their minds or that our partners were wrong to make that decision, and that we as women sort of had the right to have children if we wanted to. And both of us, that was just so unhelpful that it was really helpful to be able to sit together and say, like, do they not know our partners? Have they not seen what good and generous and wise and thoughtful people they are? It's not actually, when you love somebody, it's not actually helpful to have people sort of criticize them for making what for them has been a difficult but grounded and important choice. So that was something that we really bonded over, was, the things that people say that aren't helpful. And I think that's probably an experience that no matter what life throws at you, there'll be moments when the most helpful people are people who've walked a very similar path, because they really understand how unique and specific that experience is.
Yeah, and it's just going through these experiences, it really highlights to us that it's just not the role of every woman to be a biological mother, even if it was what they wanted, even if it's, it is within their ability. It's just not meant to be that way. I mean, we all have different abilities and different paths to walk. So it's just really recognizing also as well that meaning, purpose, all of these things come in very different forms, and our life often doesn't unfold in a different way to how we imagined.
That's so true. And actually it just reminds me, I'm not a particularly kind of I had an experience at the end of that time in New Mexico, at the end of a Zen retreat, where I met a woman who painted tarot cards, beautiful tarot cards, sort of, that was her form of art. And she offered to do a tarot card reading for me, which isn't really something that I would normally do. I'm, sort of a spiritual skeptic, like I have a mindfulness practice and a yoga practice, but there's lots of science behind all of that. And, I'm a little kind of in that space where if I can see how science would explain it, then I dive in, and if I can't, then I'm a little skeptical. But anyway, she did this reading, and it was exactly the right connection for me to have, and exactly the right message for me to hear in that moment, because she and I because I don't take these things as seriously as maybe I should, I didn't write it down or do anything like that. But there was this card she pulled, and it was because her whole pack is based in the Gaian kind of model, so it's all these figures from sort of the Gaia archetype. And it was a woman who, as I remember what she described to me, it was this woman who plays this role in a community of caring for the wider community. It's not a mother role, it's this other role. And she didn't know, I hadn't talked to her at all about the situation that I was in. But she said, what I'm seeing from these cards for you is this very strong message about this kind of caring, preserving, and nurturing role that you play at this broader sort of societal level, and that that you need to value it. And it was just a very timely time for me to be reminded of that, as a human rights lawyer who'd worked with organizations like UNICEF in Afghanistan, that there were so many opportunities for me to play a role of nurturing and caring for the world, that I could really take the deep longing I had to love and care and nurture and continue to direct it. And those spaces and places that, you have less capacity for when you have entrusted to yourself the care of actual little human beings. So that was a really timely moment for me.
Absolutely. I mean, and there's so many women who may not have their own biological children, but they're incredibly nurturing and mothering and compassionate, and are using those qualities and sharing that love and care through many relationships in their lives. I mean, and that's just a perfect example, really. I mean, we all have those kind of qualities. It's just how we direct that energy. And it's the same, like you were just saying about that lady that created those tarot cards. Again, it's another way of expressing that creative life force in a broader context. And we're all creating and expressing all the time. It's just that I suppose we're used to seeing that in a more physical, literal way through the birth of a child. But I mean, really, that's just one form of expression.
Yeah. It's one form of expression, and I guess it's one which I find there's this other fascinating aspect of our society in which women who don't have children are perceived in certain sort of stereotypical ways. And I don't mean that all people in my community or in my, social circle see me in that way, because I would say very few of them do, but there are still stereotypical representations of women with children, as being, either selfish or somehow, barren or frigid, or it's, just like very, like the stepmother or the, there's all these quite nasty versions of it.
Negative connotations with those archetypes. It's really interesting because that whole question of why don't you have a child or why don't you want a child? And really the bigger question is, why do you want a child? And most people would respond to that with, because I wanted one. And you think, well, so it's interesting that when people have made a very conscious choice not to, and they've thought about it very deeply, I always find that fascinating how they can be called selfish when they've actually given it an inordinate amount of consideration most of the time. And actually it's usually coming from a very selfless place. when they've chosen not to, because they realise what a great responsibility it is and how important it is to be fully committed. So it's interesting. It really, when often so many women, just because of how we're conditioned, they've often not even thought about what their motivation is for having a child. They've just assumed it's something that they would do. They've not always, I'm not saying every woman, but it is how we're conditioned in our society. So
it's changing though. I mean, and then the other side of that I always, I feel is really useful to kind of mention in this context, because I really think women are all in this together, is that on the other hand, society on the one hand, society sort of elevates motherhood in this kind of mythical way as being this pinnacle of feminine, experience. And on the other hand, society continues to be structured in ways that makes mothers' lives incredibly difficult.
Absolutely.
So, and actually in so many ways devalues motherhood. And so when women, invest their time in parenting and mothering, that's not valued financially. It's not valued in terms of a skill set when they then show up, to look for paid work. So I often sort of want to introduce to this conversation that there's a way in which women are, sort of constructed around motherhood, both women who have children and who don't have children, in a way that men are not. And so I feel like there's also this incredible opportunity for women to say, we're actually in this together. Like, this is not a women who have children versus women who don't have children. This is women are being constructed these ways, and men not so much.
Not at all. I mean, you don't question men, do you, who don't have children? You don't say, oh, you're a career man then, and these ridiculous comments often. And again, it's interesting, because I've been reading recently a little bit more about, again, men who would like to have had children but then hadn't met a partner, or, again, it had just not happened. And that is a lot more silent and invisible, from their perspective as well. And I know that there is some research being done around that as well. But again, that's a whole other conversation that's not given much airtime. So it's fascinating, really.
I actually have a close friend who's just a male friend who has last year ended a relationship because his partner had decided that she didn't want to have children, and he very much wanted to. And it was actually almost a little unsettling for me. I realized that had he been a female friend, I would have felt really clear that we were having a somewhat shared experience, or at least he was having an experience that I understood or could relate to. But there were some really key ways in which our experience was different because of the societal kind of expectations and assumptions. So that's a whole nother really interesting topic. But I think there was a time in my life when the sort of my sort of primary interest in engaging around conversations related to women who didn't have children was around this sort of the ways in which people who did have children, could really hurt, or say things that were really hurtful or really difficult to deal with. And maybe just because I'm in a different place now, I've become much, and because I have so many friends who are having children or who have children, and I'm so aware of all the ways in which society is deeply insensitive to, judgmental of women with children as well. I've really become interested in this as a topic of like the ways in which society defines women by their state of motherhood or non-motherhood, and then places all these judgments on them wherever they sit. Like if you're the working mother, there's a whole lot there. If you're a stay-at-home, mother who's full-time parenting and not in paid work, there's a whole lot of stuff there. And you're a woman who doesn't have children. So I'm really interested in how we as women can really be allies to each other,
Absolutely, and closing that gap between motherhood and what Melanie Notkin, the writer, calls otherhood. And, now she's a New York-based writer who's the founder of Savvy Auntie and Otherhood. And she talks a lot about all of these women in New York, where she's based, who, are extremely accomplished, successful, intelligent, and how they really struggle to meet a partner who can meet them on the same level. That, so many of these women who would love to have had a family, but they are, there are a couple of really unpleasant terms: socially infertile and circumstantially infertile, which, neither of those are particularly great terms. And it's really interesting how the dating scene and how we relate in relationships, how that's evolving, and how this varies, I suppose, from country to culture to different regions, and depending on what your upbringing's been, and all these different factors. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. I've never heard those terms before.
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm still processing that.
Yeah.
That's, interesting.
I mean, it's just highlights, just all the different circumstances and reasons why a woman that you could meet, you don't know anything about them, and those assumptions that can be made about why they've not got children, when really you have absolutely no idea. So again, that's why it's wonderful if we can just be a lot more tolerant and open-minded, and not launch in there like with foot and mouth disease and make all these kind of assumptions when really we have no idea what that person's situation is unless they've volunteered that.
So what do you think? I do think that, have you found language? I'm just kind of, as well as
it's very frustrating, the language, isn't it? Like the terminology and stuff is shocking. And like child-free, childless, all of this. I mean, I find, I guess I would identify more with child-free than childless, only because my interpretation of, I don't like the word less, because it implies lacking, and it's like, well, you're no less of a woman whether you've got a child or not. That's my belief. But then child-free, I mean, it's a very kind of, I think all of it's very unsatisfactory, and it would be nice if we could just refer to each other as women. Yes. Without all these like categories that are so limiting, these boxes, and it's incredibly, I don't know. I mean, I find it kind of frustrating and almost difficult to even express it, because it just feels so like so much of this can't really be put into words.
So I have a question for you, or maybe a question for us to talk about, which is, so even once I, very much made peace with the fact that I wasn't going to, become a mother. I have amazing nephews and nieces. There are lots of children in my life. I have like very purposeful, stimulating work. I have, so I'm very happy. I have a big extended family. I'm not worried about, these fears that you hear people evoking of dying alone, or I'm not worried at all. Like my nephews and nieces already know that they're expected to come to the retirement home. My mother's setting a good example by looking after her aunt right now. But I do notice how there's a stage, and my mother assures me it's not a very long stage once you come out the other end of it, but there's a stage of my life right now in which, in the lives of my friends with children, they're, absolutely, totally appropriately, or at least, understandably, maybe they would rather it wasn't so much like this, but their lives revolve around the timetable of parenting. And I, run a startup, a social enterprise startup, and own a business in the hospitality sector. So my timetable revolves around startup life and hospitality life.
Yeah.
And so then I find myself at this stage of my life where I have just very few friends whose timetables operate the same as mine, and even just whose experiences overlap with mine. There's an increasingly small number of close friends with whom I share the experiences of being in my mid-40s and living the life that you live when you're not a parent. And I wonder whether you've come across that in your conversations with other people, and how that shows up for people.
Yeah, but interestingly, and again, I don't know whether this is to do with geography, so I'm based in Sydney, but I know so many women who are in that situation, who are business owners, who are single. I mean, some of them are in relationships, or like me, their partner might have children already, so they're a step parent. And so it's varied. I mean, do you think that's due to, as well, partly where you live? I guess it can also be, as well, the people that you're coming into contact with on a daily basis, like the sort of work that you are doing. Are you working mainly with people who are parents, or do you know?
No, I work mainly with people who are younger than me.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm because I work in campaigning.
Yes.
I'm quite a bit older than most people who work in human rights campaigning. So I work mostly with younger people, and in the social enterprise and tech startup world, it's mostly people who are younger than me, and the same in hospitality, I guess. So maybe that is a unique set of circumstances. And then the friends who I have outside of that work environment, a lot of them are having children. I have noticed, which is interesting, there's a sort of a small core of close friends of my partner and I who are also couples who either don't have children or whose children are grown.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. So some of them might be people who are parents. Yeah, so their children have left home. They've got children who are off to university or even older than that. And there is a kind of a lovely little social core of people who, we go on holidays together. And it's not that I don't want a holiday with kids. I just went on a 3-week, trip with my sisters and parents and all their partners and all their children. And I love traveling with kids. But people who have kids tend not to invite people who don't have kids along holiday with them. So, which is also understandable. Yeah, so I think maybe just in smaller cities, I still would say there's less of a critical mass still of women in their 40s, couples in their 40s, or single women in their 40s, or single men in their 40s who don't have children.
But there are meetup groups and stuff around the world, so it would be interesting to see what there is in New Zealand, because I know, for example, Jodie Day, who is the founder of Gateway Women, who's based in London, I know through her forum there are meetup groups all over the world, and she's kind of one of the leading voices in this sector for women without children, and has written a great book actually that's just been re-released called Living the Life Unexpected, which is a really great book that's got all sorts of resources in. But also recently I connected with Dr. Chloe Peacock, who is in the UK also, and she founded, one of the co-founders of the League of Fabulous Women, and that is a friendship network for women without children. And because she was in a situation whereby all her friends were having children, she started to realise that obviously, new mums, and that they're sort of making friends with all these other new mums. And so obviously their time's very much focused on that experience that they're going through and that massive change in their life. And so she had the thought of, well, I really need to make some other friends with like-minded women. And so she just thought, okay, well, she couldn't find a meetup group. So she thought, well, I'll just create one. And she has been overwhelmed at the response. And now there are these meetup groups all over the UK. And that's taken off in a relatively short space of time. And so there are lots of things like that happening. So I'm sure, I'm absolutely convinced that there would be similar things happening in New Zealand, definitely.
Yeah, I'm sure there would be, actually.
Yeah.
I'm actually quite deeply introverted, so the idea of going to a thing with strangers is like...
No, I know, it's kind of, but it's yeah, look, it's great though that there are these things out there, and there are more and more online forums and different things as well, because I'm starting to, I've connected with so many of these kind of around the world, and recently with some others over in Europe as well. So it's definitely, because obviously it's a rapidly growing demographic of women. So there's around a quarter of women around the world, 40 plus, who don't have children, but that number has doubled in the last 10 years, and it's only going to increase more rapidly. So there are going to be, more of these forums and groups, and just more of these things set up, really, where we are talking about this more openly.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, of course, is that, as my mother has pointed out to me, is that the period of your life in which parenting is a big part of your life is relatively short compared to if you're lucky and have a long life, as my parents have.
Yeah.
So this is the other thing that she says to me. She's like, right now this is huge, and people are very interested in defining you as a woman in relation to, whether you are a parent or not a parent, whether you're a mother or not, and your friends' lives are, sort of very much consumed with their role as parents. And she said, and like, give them 10 years and that will be shifting quite significantly. And in 20 years, it's completely changed again. So that was a very interesting reflection to have from your own mother.
Yes.
To have your mother saying, and what she said even more explicitly than that was like, well, yes, being a mother to you and your sisters has been a wonderful and a joyful and a rewarding part of my life, but it's not the most important thing I've done in my life.
Yeah.
And it's not even doesn't even any longer consume large parts of my life. So that's, and I think that's maybe rare for it. Again, it's a little bit socially unacceptable.
Well, that's very honest of her to say that. But also I was just thinking, then there's that stage though, where women have all of their friends are becoming grandmothers. And then if they're not experiencing that, because I know my mum's in that situation at the moment where, I guess her sisters, like my aunts and a lot of her friends are constantly doing things with their grandchildren. So again, that can bring up those pangs of not having that experience. So again, it's just these different stages and cycles. I mean, it's very interesting. There's just so much. And like you say, that might be something that's a focus for a certain period of time, and then it's something else,
Yeah. Well, it was interesting to me. It was very helpful to me to have my mother say that. I mean, what she said to me, which is not going to be true for everybody, by a very long shot, she was very clear, I'm not telling you a sort of a general truth, I'm just telling you my experience. And she said, in my experience, the choice that I've made that has had the greatest impact on the quality of my life, outside of the internal choices I've made, about how I orient myself in relation to, the world. But the external choice that's had the greatest impact is my choice of partner, my choice of life partner. And she said, you and your sisters were around in our home for like 20 years max. And she's like, I've lived with your father now for 50 years. And for the last 30 years, it's just been us making the life together that works for us. And I know that, that's absolutely not a generalizable experience.
No, it's not.
But it was sort of a slightly, I still think it was a little brave of her to say that, because I think it's great to have your mother look at you and say, I love you, and yet you're not the most important choice I've made. I just think for some reason that's a little bit counter, to cultural norms. Parents are supposed to tell their children that their children are the most important things they've done in their lives.
Well, she sounds like a very cool and well-balanced woman, I think.
Yes, well, she's very thoughtful as well. Like, she would give a lot of thought to what she would and wouldn't say.
Yeah.
Which I think I'm very fortunate, because I'm not sure that that's the case in everybody's life.
Absolutely. And so what do you feel, Marianne, then are the major benefits that you've experienced by then not having children?
Oh, great question. Well, I mean, I'm able to pour myself into work that I think is incredibly important. There are moments, I would say probably there are moments when I move through the world and have a sudden sort of glimpse of the scale and the urgency of some of the challenges facing the world. Yeah. And in those moments, I am so grateful that I am able to give my all to work that I believe is contributing in a very sort of significant and hopefully effective way to addressing those challenges. And I'm very grateful for that in that moment. And I know I have friends who have children who also hit those moments, and they do grapple with, look at the state of the world, look how urgent these challenges are, whether we're talking about, climate change or poverty or, growing inequality or, a whole range of different social and environmental problems. And they really do grapple with the fact that they are committed now to investing, their energy into raising these children who they love very, very, very much, but they're also aware that they've brought those children into a world that they now can't really contribute effectively to transforming. And so I feel very grateful for that. I think that's an incredible freedom, that when I see something, I can throw myself at it completely. And that's the number one for me, without a doubt. Like, my life is driven by my love for purposeful work and my sense of possibility of really making a really significant positive impact in the time I have here. So that's huge for me. And then the other piece would be just the, I have incredible freedom and flexibility, and that can show up sometimes in the ways that I can even support my friends who do have kids. Not always, because the way I throw myself into this work, this sort of world-changing work, sometimes means that, I'm not around, or I'm otherwise occupied. But there is this wonderful freedom where I can just, my friend recently, was a while ago now, but it's an easy example. Her husband went overseas for work for 3 weeks, and she lives really almost right next door to me. And so she had a school-age child, a preschooler, and a new baby.
Gosh. And
there was just this moment in the morning, literally from 8 a.m. to 9, when if she could leave the baby asleep and the preschooler playing while she took the school-age child to school, it just made her whole morning go so much better. And I was able to just go there.
Yeah.
Go to the house and be there for that period of time. And I think, I do think there's a piece of the way that our communities perhaps I don't want to say, are supposed to work, because that carries a kind of a judgmental, but I do think that communities for millennia, I think there must have been this role played by people who didn't have their own children.
Yeah.
That sort of, so that's a real delight to be able to do that. And then, I mean, let's be honest, it's just, we can travel and
sleep in.
Oh no, I can't sleep in.
You've got the choice. But you've got the choice. I'm not either, actually, which is quite annoying. But we have that in theory.
In theory, well, no, yes, and sleeping in for me is not a pleasure. What is a deep pleasure for me, and one that is unavailable to most parents most of the time, is wake up early to a quiet house.
Yes, true.
And make myself my morning coffee and go and sit and meditate or read or do whatever it is that I feel, elevates me for the day, in a quiet house with nobody demanding my attention, which is an incredible privilege.
It really is, and it is a luxury.
Yeah, it really is. I love it. So that sort of, and just quiet. I mean, I often think, however much I really wanted to have children, I do wonder sometimes how I would have coped, because I'm I am very introverted. I love to be alone. I love to be in quiet. I have friends who are like me, who are, really introverted women who love their space and their quiet. And mothering has been very challenging for them. Very, very challenging in a way that I'm not sure it is as challenging for extroverts or even people who are more sort of, what they say, ambiverted. I think that, the demands of ever-present children is really tough for women of a temperament where we really need peace and quiet and alone time. Sometimes I think I might have really saved a potential child. The trauma of having a mother that kept locking herself in the toilet.
Yeah, so true, so true. So, well, thank you so much, Marianne. It's been great talking to you. And so, are you able to share the best place that people can find you online and more about your work?
Yes, well, I have a website, which is Marianne&Elliott.com, which features some of my writing and my book, which is a book about my time in Afghanistan. And that book touches on the relationship that I referred to, the one that was the first relationship I was in where my partner didn't want to have children, and does go through some of the pain of that, amongst other things that happen when you're an aid worker in Afghanistan. And then I'm not terribly active writing on that site at the moment because most of my energy at the moment goes into this other project called Action Station, which is a local New Zealand advocacy project. But yes, you can still find old writing and the book, which might be of interest to people who are interested in the lives that those of us who don't have children follow.
Absolutely. So, well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you for having the podcast and for creating this conversation. It's really a wonderful offering.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Unclassified Woman. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. For information on events and services, connect with Michelle at michellemariemcgrath.com.